Right. Good evening, Luca family. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. And Roy, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present this podcast webinar. Tonight, I'm going to kick it off, and we're going to be speaking about defining your local union's podcast vision with purpose, the values, and long-term impact. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started and go to the next slide. And when it comes to your local union podcast vision, there are some key questions that you want to ask yourself. First one being, why does your local need a podcast? Who are we primarily speaking to? And what role should this podcast play in our union culture? And how does this support organizing and solidarity? And when you see those questions, the first one, why does our local need a podcast? It's because it fills the gaps that traditional union communications can't. Unfortunately, not every member goes to meetings, or checks their emails on the daily. The union podcast meets members where they're at, whether they're in their car, on their break, and before and after work. And when it comes to who are we primarily speaking to, obviously you're going to be speaking to your members, the rank and file. You can also speak to elected individuals such as stewards and also new members and longtime members. And when it comes to what role should this podcast play in our union culture, it helps shape how members see themselves and how they see their union and their collective power. And when it comes to how does this support organizing and solidarity, it helps members to see the situation or problem as shared and not just an individual by themselves. And also helps prepare members for action. And as we go to the next slide, you want to have a clear understanding of what your goals and who your audience is. So obviously, your goal is to inform and educate members. You want to strengthen connection and trust. You want to support organizing and campaigns, and you want to reach future members and allies. And next, when we talk about our core themes of messaging in our podcast, you want to speak about, collective power and solidarity. You want to amplify members' voices. You want to be able to let them share their lived experiences. You want to educate members on rights, contracts, and issues that are ongoing. You want to amplify union wins. You want to speak on challenges. And you also want to talk about the lessons learned. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Denver.
Thank you, Charles. And thanks everybody for jumping on tonight. Building off what Charles said, once, you've got that podcast up and going, how do you know that it's really doing what you want it to do? He talked a little bit about, kind of defining the goals, but, specifically, when you're getting started, figure out, what you really want it to be. Is it just, general information? Is it, you're trying to get education out there? Is it going to be multiple things? And so once you have that goal and you're up and running and you know what you want to do, the big thing really is tracking the data from the podcast. I mean, that's the beauty with any digital communications is, how many listens or views if there's a video component, if your followers are growing and you're reaching out to more of your members, if you're seeing people sharing and commenting, that's really where it's important because, I can listen to a couple of seconds of it, but not really be taking it in, or I can just click the like because everything my local does, I'm going to like it. But when they're sharing it and when they're commenting, that's the engagement that you really want. That's when you get a lot of shares and comments, you're on track. And once you have all that data, you can then, use that to maybe adjust your goals. Maybe what you're doing isn't working. So you want to try something else and you want to mix it up. Or maybe it's working great in certain areas and you want to focus in on, those things that are really, catching on, that's really driving the engagement. So it's really about, having a clear vision, following up with that vision, making sure that it's working, and being able to change it up or perfect it, fine tune it. And I'll toss it back to Charles.
Thank you, Denver. And when it comes to your podcast, you want to try to align it with major union campaigns that are going on. Like one of the biggest would obviously be contract negotiations, organizing drives that are going on, political or legislative fights. Obviously, it's a big year, political year, especially in Michigan. You also want to tie into internal education efforts. And these are just a couple examples of, how you can take your podcast episode and align it with, major union campaigns. And here we go on the next slide. You can talk about when you're using the union podcast during campaigns, you want to give pre-campaign education, like what's the campaign about? You want to provide members that information, what the goals. You kind of want to outline the campaign as a whole. And then throughout the campaign, You also want to give updates. You want to give a survey to members to, ask questions and use that in your podcast to answer frequently asked questions. You also want to, after the campaign, you want to do a post reflection. What are some of the lessons we learned? What did we do right? What went wrong? You want to learn from that and grow from that during these campaigns.
And, all those things that Charles just mentioned, it will take a different type of podcast. If you're doing, for example, an education push, maybe you want to do something that's scripted where you've got all these certain bullet points that you want to hit. And so you're very carefully, you have a single host usually, and they're reading from a script. Maybe there's some pre-scripted questions from members that you can incorporate in. The most popular format is, the one-on-one interview, just because that's the easiest. Now, that again, that might not be applicable to what's going on. You might want to do a panel where you're bringing in a bunch of people. Now, the degree of difficulty with that is a lot higher. You need more equipment. You need somebody that can kind of corral and kind of direct traffic, so to speak. One of my preferred podcast styles, just because it allows for more control, is more of a documentary style, where maybe you're doing interviews with folks and you're taking it back and you're editing various interviews together to kind of tell the story or the issues, because sometimes just not everybody can be in one place at one time. So you can't do a panel. And so if you're doing a bunch of one-on-one interviews, instead of spreading them out over a bunch of episodes, you can just condense them down into one. And so, yeah, really it's just being able to be flexible, to know what's going to, serve your subject matter best. And along those lines, once you've decided what kind of a show it's going to be, what the format is, one-on-one, panel, whatever, you want to keep in mind, obviously, length is a big one. The average podcast, as you see, it's 30 to 45 minutes. Now, all of these things, I would say, are more guidelines than hard and fast rules, because I've listened to podcasts that are 3 hours long. If the subject matter is good and you have great people doing the podcast, people will listen for a long time. And then on the flip side, don't feel you have to stretch it out to fit a half an hour, because if it's a bunch of filler and fluff and, you're repeating the question over and over, or it's just someone that maybe is not a dynamic speaker, hey, a 10-minute podcast that's to the point, impactful, it can be just as good as a half an hour long, drawn out, boring one. Now, tone is also very important, because obviously an educational podcast is going to be a lot different than, let's say a campaign type podcast where you're trying to get people fired up and engaged and active. You need someone who's a more dynamic, motivational speaker. Obviously, regardless of the type of podcast, you want to always keep it professional. It's not everybody that can pull off using colorful language and things like that. So you got to be careful. You don't want to ruffle too many feathers anyway. And then the last thing, when it comes to the structure of your show, is making a realistic regular schedule for yourself and for your podcast team. Most podcasts release weekly and they release at the same time and day. So let's say Thursday at 8 p.m. Now, again, there's no hard and fast rules. You might not have enough content to do one that's every single week. So every other week, once a month, as long as you're letting the listeners know when to anticipate, okay, we're taking a week off, we'll see you in 2 weeks, or, we're only going to come in and do an episode when we feel that there's something going on. So as long as people know what's going on, that'll go a long way. But for the most part, try to come up with a regular schedule.
All right. And with that being said, let's talk about brainstorming episode topics. Obviously, you can reach out to members from your job. You can also reach out to stewards, other elected officials, education committees, anyone that can help provide training. If that's what the episode you want to showcase. There's also, you can dive in and talk about your local union history. There might be, someone at your local who's been there for a while that, is full of rich history that most of the membership doesn't know about. Maybe your local has a local union library where you can find out information about your local union. And also, maybe you want to look into addressing current issues that are affecting members. These are just a few examples of episodes that you can do your podcast on. With the next slide, you want to build an episode calendar. As Denver said, you want to set a realistic release schedule. Most of us work, so you want to set your schedule that's manageable for you and whoever else might be helping you with your podcast. You want to balance out evergreen and timely content. You don't want obviously it to be too much content in one episode. You want to be able to let the viewer digest what you're saying and really take away from it. And you also want to be timely. You don't want to release something that's too old or something that's previously happened that people aren't really thinking about anymore. And you also want to plan around key union dates. Like obviously this year is a year with so many different conferences upcoming and going on. It's really the year for you Luca delegates to shine. You got the CAP conference, you got the financial conference, you got the constitutional convention, and it's really an opportunity for you to jump out here and do a podcast and create some content. And next, you want to consider your guest planning. Obviously, we stated, members, elected officials such as stewards, local leadership, maybe your president, committees are also a good idea to interview. And you also want to look towards allied unions and community partners as well. And with the next slide here, when it comes to episode content planning, you want a clear objective for each episode. And you want, depending on what the topic is, you want a loose outline and you just want questions to help guide the interview along. And you also want to have a clear call to action. I'm sorry. You want to be able to encourage members to create an action to do something.
Okay, so now when it comes to actually recording the show, this is where things can get logistically challenging. So Charles talked a bit about, who's going to be on the show. The biggest challenge that I found is just coordinating schedules. So the guest, the host, if you have like a producer or engineer, getting all those people in one place can be hard. That's why obviously Zoom can be great. Once you have that date set, kind of do not a super in-depth pre-interview, but at least just touch base on, okay, here's the things we're going to talk about. That's a good time to maybe if there's things that you don't know about the person or the topic that you guys can iron out all those details. Location can be huge. In a perfect world, you've got a constant place, maybe at the local, but somewhere where has good sound. You don't want to do it in a big, huge echoey hall or someplace that's in a heavy traffic area where there's a lot of people walking and talking around. And that's why Zoom can often be a good option. And regardless of how you're going to do it, make sure everything is set up and tested way ahead of time. Now, a lot of podcasts don't necessarily go live, but if you've got guests, you don't want to be scrambling at the last minute, holding everybody up while you figure out your tech issues, especially if it's Zoom. When you do the pre-interview, that's a good time to test things out, make sure they're working. If you've got a bunch of audio recording equipment at wherever you're recording and people are coming to you, make sure you get it all set up and tested. I like to do it like at least an hour ahead of time because if something can go wrong, it will. So that way it gives you plenty of time to troubleshoot. And then, just also rehearse, especially if you haven't done it a lot, just getting out there in front of the equipment, maybe with no one around. You're just reading. If you have a script, you're reading a little bit of the script, you're asking some of the questions just to get familiarity. That way, when it comes time to actually doing it, you're not struggling and fumbling around, and it'll just save you time in editing it later. Okay, so once you have the show recorded, that's really, in my mind, the way I look at it, that's really only half of the work. The other half is getting people to actually listen or watch it. A lot of times, especially when I work with people who are just starting out, they're like, it's posted, I'm done. Everyone's going to come flocking to my podcast and I'm going to get views and listens. But unfortunately, there's just so much out there now, so much content out there now that you really have to be promoting and pushing your show. So obviously get it out on all the social media platforms. I mentioned here behind the scenes footage or photos of you with the guests Or if you're not together, just get a good picture of the guest. So that way, if you've got a link to the audio, you can put up a picture of the person or of you with the guest. Any other little things like that. Nowadays, people are always doing these little TikToks, fun, goofy stuff just to kind of entice people to go to the podcast. Whoever your guests are, get them to share it on their socials, get local members, get your friends, your families, whoever it is, recruit them to help you. And besides social media, you've got more of the traditional outlets, like email, newsletters, websites, go to events and just literally tell people, hey, go to a meeting. I got a podcast. Everybody listen this time, this time, this time, So really, this is huge. And it's a lot. People don't do this or take this end of it seriously enough, in my humble opinion. And I think that's it for me. Charles?
Yep. And now let's kind of jump into roles and responsibilities. When it comes to your podcast, you got to make a decision on, who's going to host or be the facilitator. Obviously, you would want someone that's able to speak, able to keep the podcast flowing and going. When it comes to your producer and editor, obviously, you're going to want someone who knows how to edit. If you're doing video, you want a video editor. And then you also, if it's just, sound, you want someone to be able to edit that sound. And you want a content planner, someone that's going to be able to come up with the ideas of what content you're going to be doing. And then you want someone that's going to be able to promote it, who's going to be your promotion lead, or maybe you're going to be the person that does it all. And, when it comes to your podcast workflow, obviously Denver spoke on, planning and scheduling. You want to be consistent with your podcast episodes when they're coming out. You also want to consider, how you're recording them. What are you using? You want to consider your editing. What software you're going to be using to edit it? What's going to be your checklist when you're reviewing your podcast? And then when it comes to publishing and promotion, what platforms are you going to be putting your podcast on? How are you going to promote it? Are you going to have graphics? Are you going to have reels? Those are some key factors that you should consider when it comes to your podcast. And, when it comes to sustaining the podcast, you don't need all the fancy equipment in the world. You can start small. And as you, get better, get more comfortable, you can start to upgrade and make it more advanced. Also, if you're working in a team, you want to rotate your roles when possible. What if someone's sick? Someone can't make it. You want to be able to still be able to produce your podcast no matter what might happen. And then also, you want to evaluate and adjust regularly, what content is getting more views, what's capturing members' attention, what can I do better, what worked, what didn't work. Just some key things to think about when it comes to your podcast.
And if I could just jump on what Charles said, the starting small and building up, that is huge. That is, I think, a great way for people to get going, because if you try to go crazy with all the bells and whistles, it'll just seem overwhelming. And I've seen that be like the biggest downfall, which why podcasts don't continue. People just get burnt out, So if you start small and you kind of work up to the level that is comfortable for you as far as access to equipment and time availability and people that you're working with, interest level, I cannot stress that enough. So that was a huge point that he made there. And I think, Roy, that's it from us.